There is a sound a Detroit diesel 8V71 makes that no John Deere ever made from the factory, a flat mechanical bark that carries across half a section of frozen ground, and on the last Tuesday of harvest, that sound was the only thing moving through the cold, over 300 acres of sugar beets north of Grafton, North Dakota. The frost had come in hard the night before, the kind that turns gumbo mud into something between concrete and glue, the kind that had already stopped two neighboring outfits dead in their tracks that same week. But the 8630 kept coming, row after row, the 24-foot chisel plow behind it throwing black clods in a steady rhythm, the whole rig holding a sustained 4.9 miles an hour through mud that had no business letting anything move at all. He sat up in the cab with the heater blowing weak against the windshield frost, watching the tachometer needle sit steady, where it had no right to sit steady, not on a tractor that had died in a field 6 weeks earlier with a rod through the block. 11,400 hours on the original engine, more than 2 decades of his own maintenance records, in a binder that lived on the shop shelf, and none of it had mattered the day the bottom end let go. What mattered now was the Detroit under the hood, pulled out of a wrecked grain truck for $3,400 at a dispersal auction, sitting where a $31,000 factory-reman was supposed to go, bolted in with steel plates he'd cut by hand, and a bellhousing he'd had machined to marry 2 engines that were never meant to know each other. 3 days before freeze-up would lock the ground for good, the last beet came up out of the mud and rolled onto the piler, and the contract that had been sitting over his kitchen table like a debt collector for 6 weeks, $58,000, due, no extensions, was finally, quietly, satisfied. It was right about then, with the plow still ticking as it cooled and the Detroit idling low and rough the way big diesels do, that the dealership's service truck came up the approach road. It wasn't there for the tractor in the field. It was there for the loader tractor, a separate warranty call, unrelated business, the kind of routine visit that happens on any working farm. But the technician didn't stay by the loader long. He walked the fence line to where the 8630 sat cooling, crouched down by the bellhousing, and took out his phone. He didn't write anything up. He didn't mention the voided warranty sitting in a file back at the dealership, the one his own service manager had signed off on weeks before. He just took photographs of the adapter plate, of the welds, of the rerouted cooling lines running to a salvaged radiator core, the same way a man documents something he intends to remember on his own time, for his own reasons. None of it made sense yet to anyone standing in that field. To understand it, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the morning the tractor first went quiet in the middle of 300 unfinished acres. 6 weeks earlier, the ground near Grafton was already telling him things he didn't want to hear. 20 years he'd worked this stretch of the Red River Valley. 1,340 acres of sugar beets and small grains laid out in fields his father had broken to the plow, with equipment half as capable as what stood in the machine shed now. 20 years of learning what the black gumbo soil could do to a schedule, how it could turn from workable to impossible in the space of a single rain, how the difference between a finished harvest and a ruined one was sometimes nothing more than 3 or 4 dry days strung together at exactly the right moment in October. He knew that ground the way a man knows a difficult relative, with respect, with wariness, and with no illusions about what it owed him. The 8630 had been part of that 20 years for most of it, bought used when it already carried hours on the meter, and by that wet fall it had logged 11,400 of them, every one documented in a binder he kept in the tractor's cab door pocket, oil changes and filter swaps and injector work written down in his own hand, going back further than some of his neighbors had been farming on their own. It was not a young tractor. It was not, by dealership standards, a machine anyone expected miracles from. But it had never let him down in a way that cost him a harvest, And that counted for something in a business where machines were trusted the way men were trusted, slowly, and only after they'd proven it under load, in mud, in cold, in the hours nobody was watching. That fall had been wet from the start, the kind of wet that stacked up delay on delay until the whole season felt like it was leaning against him. 300 acres of beets stood unharvested going into the back half of October, the co-op contract sitting at $58,000 with a delivery window that did not care about weather or machinery or a man's 20 years of good judgment. He had been running the 8630 hard, through standing water and heavy ground, pushing it because the alternative was watching the window close, when the engine dropped a rod clean through the block on a Tuesday morning with the exhaust stack still ticking from the effort. The sound of it was not subtle. It was the sound every operator dreads, and none of them forget once they've heard it. Metal finding metal where metal was never meant to meet. The engine dying not with a sputter, but with a single decisive shudder, and then silence over 300 acres that were still standing in the field behind him, waiting on a machine that no longer had the will or the ability to finish the job. He drove to the dealership the next morning with the kind of calm that comes from a man who has already done the arithmetic and doesn't like any of the numbers, but goes through the motions anyway, because that's what 20 years of buying green paint teaches you to do. The service counter at the Grafton dealership was the same counter he'd stood at for parts and filters and the occasional warranty claim since before his son could walk. And the man behind it that morning was not unkind, exactly, just certain in the particular way that comes from reciting a policy rather than making a judgment. The quote came printed on letterhead, itemized like a court document. One factory-reman long block for the 8630, $31,000 even, freight not included, and a lead time of 14 weeks from order date, contingent on availability out of the regional distribution center, which the parts manager admitted, almost as an aside, was already backed up from 2 other breakdowns that fall. 14 weeks put him into February. 300 acres of beets could not wait until February. The co-op contract could not wait until February. He said as much, plainly, the way he'd say the ground was wet or the price of diesel was up, and the service manager nodded like he'd heard the complaint before, which he had, from other men sitting in other chairs across that same counter, all of them arriving at the same wall at the same time of year. What came next was less a conversation than a warning delivered with the practiced flatness of someone reading from a manual he'd read 100 times before. If the farmer sourced an engine anywhere outside factory channels, a rebuild, a used unit, anything not stamped and tracked through John Deere's own system, it would void the parts warranty not only on the 8630 itself, but on the planter he'd bought new only 2 seasons back, and on the loader tractor sitting in his machine shed that still had 11 months of coverage left on a transmission repair that had already cost him enough grief the first time around. The service manager said it without malice, the way a bank teller reads back a balance, but the meaning landed the same regardless of the tone. Whatever he decided to do next, he would be doing it alone, cut loose from every safety net the dealership had ever extended him, all 3 machines suddenly standing outside the fence at once. He thanked the man, folded the printed quote into his coat pocket, and walked back out into a parking lot slicked with the same wet fall that had started all of this, doing the math again in his head the whole way to the truck. 14 weeks against 3 days of freeze-up margin, $31,000 against a $58,000 contract that assumed the crop would actually get out of the ground, and no version of the equation that balanced in the dealership's favor. That night, the kitchen table did the work the dealership's fluorescent lights hadn't, the way it always did in that house. A legal pad, a calculator with a cracked corner, and the particular quiet that settles over a farm family when the numbers refuse to be kind, no matter how many times you run them. The insurance adjuster had already called that afternoon, polite and unhurried, offering $9,200 for the block and the internals, a figure arrived at through some depreciation table that treated 11,400 documented hours of maintenance receipts as though they were confetti. He'd kept every one of those receipts in a binder for over 20 years, oil changes and filter swaps and injector work logged in his own handwriting, and the adjuster's number felt less like a settlement than an insult wearing a settlement's clothes. Subtract that from $31,000, and the gap didn't close so much as widen into something closer to a canyon. The bank was no gentler, though it wasn't unkind either, just built for a different calendar than the one Frost and Freeze-Up were keeping. The operating loan renewed every spring on the assumption that a crop would go in and come out on schedule, and the loan officer, a reasonable man who'd sat across that same table for 8 years running, had already made clear that a 14-week engine wait pushing into a missed beet delivery wasn't a hardship the bank had a line item for. It was a default, plain as that, the kind that didn't ruin a man in one stroke, but set the ruin in motion quietly, the way frost works into a foundation before anyone sees the crack. And underneath both of those sat the beet co-op's contract, which didn't bend for weather or misfortune or good intentions, a hard date, printed and signed, tied to a $58,000 delivery that assumed 300 acres would be out of the ground before the ground itself turned to iron. He'd read that contract enough times over the years that he could recite the delivery clause without looking, and reading it again that night, he understood it wasn't a document anymore so much as a countdown. He set the pencil down at some point past midnight, the coffee gone cold in its cup, and looked at the 3 numbers laid out in a row like tombstones, the adjuster's offer, the bank's terms, the co-op's deadline, and saw that every one of them pointed the same direction. 14 weeks wasn't a wait. It was a guarantee, dressed up as patience, that he would lose the contract, strain the loan, and still owe on a warranty he could no longer use. Somewhere in that arithmetic, sometime before the coffee went cold a second time, the decision stopped being a question of if and became a question of where. And that was the night he first thought about the grain trucks sitting out at the Lindquist dispersal auction 2 counties over, the ones nobody wanted because their frames were cracked and worthless, except for what sat bolted under their hoods. He mentioned it first at the co-op counter, not because he wanted advice, but because a man doesn't buy a diesel out of a dead grain truck without somebody eventually asking why his truck insurance lapsed, and word travels through Grafton faster than seed corn prices. By the second morning it had made its way to the coffee shop on Main, the one with the cracked linoleum and the round table by the window where the retired men sat from 7 to 9, like they were still punching a clock, and from there it moved the way all things moved in that town, slow, certain, and without mercy. The coffee shop crowd had its own unwritten scripture, and chief among its commandments was that an engine belonged to the machine it was built for, the way a horse belonged to its own harness, and that swapping iron across those lines wasn't clever so much as it was a kind of trespass against an order nobody had voted on but everybody upheld. A tractor engine went in a tractor, a truck engine went in a truck. Deere green stayed Deere green, and a man who couldn't respect that wasn't thrifty, he was reckless, and there was a difference between the two that the men at that table felt qualified to adjudicate over eggs and hash browns. One of them, a neighbor who'd farmed wheat and canola 3 miles east for as long as anyone could remember, a man who wore his skepticism like a second coat, put it plainest, loud enough that it reached the counter. He said that Detroit Diesel might run trucks down the interstate just fine, but bolted into a row crop chassis built for a Deere powertrain, and the first time that tractor hit real load in wet ground, the driveline would twist like a wet dish rag and snap clean in half before it ever got a beet out of the mud. He said it with the flat confidence of a man reciting scripture, and a few heads nodded around him, not because they'd run the numbers, but because it sounded like the kind of thing that ought to be true. He heard the story secondhand, the way a man hears most things said about him in a town that size, filtered through a hired hand who'd been in the shop for coffee and brought it back like a burr caught in his coveralls. He didn't argue it. He didn't drive into town to set anybody straight. He only asked, once, whether the neighbor had ever actually calculated a torque curve in his life, or whether he was going off the sound of the words that truck engine and sitting too close together in the same sentence. Nobody answered that, because nobody had an answer, and the silence told him something worth knowing, that the whole objection was built on the shape of the idea and not the substance of it, which meant the only thing left to argue with was iron itself, cut and fitted and proven under load, out where the coffee crowd couldn't reach it. The engine itself had come from a place that had nothing to do with tractors at all, which was, in its way, the whole point. 3 weeks before the rod let go in the 8630, a dispersal auction had been held on a section of land 40 miles west, where a hauling outfit that had run sugar beets and wheat to the co-op elevators for the better part of 3 decades was finally closing its books. The family running it had lost the contract to a bigger carrier out of Fargo, and what was left of their operation was being sold off piece by piece in a gravel yard still smelling of diesel and cut alfalfa. A scatter of grain trailers, a portable auger, a truck scale nobody wanted, and, parked at the back of the row where the auctioneer's assistant had to walk buyers out to see it, a 1980s International grain hauler with a cracked frame rail behind the cab, retired, not because the engine had failed, but because the truck itself had finally given out from 20 years of loaded miles on gravel roads that never forgave anybody. Under the hood was a Detroit diesel 8V71, two-stroke, still turning over clean when the auctioneer's helper thumbed the starter for the crowd, blowing its short bark of exhaust into the cold morning air like it had something left to prove. The auctioneer, working the crowd the way auctioneers do, half theater and half undertaker, had leaned into the microphone and made the kind of joke that gets repeated for years afterward in coffee shops that have nothing better to talk about, noting, with the timing of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, that here were the guts of one dying operation about to be sold to save another, that International had folded its truck line the same decade Detroit Diesel had been sold off piecemeal by its parent company, and that a man would have to look twice to find 2 more thoroughly humbled American names sharing space under one hood. A few people laughed. He didn't, not out loud, but he wrote the bid number down on the back of a co-op receipt in his shirt pocket and did the arithmetic 3 times before he raised his hand. The bidding didn't go high. Nobody else in that yard wanted a truck engine with no truck attached to it, and the hammer came down at $3,400, which was, by the standards of anything with the word engine, in the same sentence as John Deere, a number so small it felt almost indecent. He paid in a cashier's check he'd had made out that morning without telling anyone what it was for, loaded the block onto a flatbed trailer borrowed from a neighbor who didn't ask questions, and hauled it home past fields already stripped bare by combines that hadn't stopped for rain, the whole way turning over in his mind not whether the engine would fit, because he already half suspected it wouldn't, but what exactly it would take to make it fit anyway. The problem revealed itself the way problems in that shop always did, not all at once but in layers, the way frost comes up out of ground that looks solid until you put a spade to it. He backed the flatbed into the shop that same evening and spent an hour just looking, walking around the block with a trouble light in one hand and a tape measure in the other, not touching anything yet, because his father had taught him that the first hour with a strange engine should be spent thinking, not wrenching. What he was looking at was a Detroit diesel 8V71, a two-stroke, which meant it breathed and fired on a fundamentally different rhythm than anything Deere had ever built. No long, lazy, four-stroke compression stroke drawing air down through a manifold, but a blower forcing air through ports cut into the cylinder walls themselves. Every downstroke a power stroke, the engine turning over with a flat, hammering cadence that old truck drivers used to say sounded like the engine was angry at you personally. The Deere's own diesel, the one that had thrown its rod somewhere out past the section line, had never asked the drivetrain to absorb power delivered in that particular rhythm, and he understood, standing there, that this was not a question he could answer by feel. It was a question of numbers. The bellhousing bolt pattern was the first wall. Deere's engineers had cast their bellhousing to a spacing that matched nothing Detroit had ever built, because the two companies had never once in their corporate histories imagined a farmer in Grafton, North Dakota, trying to marry the two, and so the bolt holes simply did not line up, not by an inch, not by a fraction of one. They were speaking two different mechanical languages entirely. The second wall was the PTO. The Deere's power takeoff shaft was engineered to spin at a fixed, certified speed off the engine's flywheel, a number written into the tractor's original specification sheet, and trusted by every implement he owned, including the planter the dealership had specifically warned him about, and a Detroit two-stroke, geared for highway truck duty, would deliver torque and shaft speed that bore no honest relationship to that number unless something intervened to correct it. And the third wall, the one the service manager back at the dealership had leaned on hardest when he'd called to ask, almost as a courtesy, whether there was any way to make this work under warranty. The firing character itself, the violent, uneven hammering of a two-stroke against the smooth, timed pulse, a Deere transmission and rear end had been engineered to absorb for 40 years without complaint. The service manager had said the word impossible twice in that phone call, slowly, the way a man says a word he wants remembered, and then he'd said it a third time for good measure before hanging up. Standing in his shop with the trouble light throwing long shadows across the block, he didn't disagree with any of it. He just didn't think impossible was the same thing as unbuildable. So he began the way he began every hard job on that farm, which was to write it down before he cut a single piece of steel, because a man who trusts his memory over his own handwriting is a man asking to repeat a mistake twice. The binder was an old 3-ring, its cover long since gone soft and dark with handling, and on the first fresh page he sketched the bellhousing bolt pattern of the Detroit next to the pattern on the Deere's transmission case, two constellations of holes that shared no common star, and he measured the offset in 30/2 of an inch until the page was crowded with numbers small enough to need reading glasses. The adapter plate came first, 3/4-inch plate steel laid flat across the shop's cutting table, and he worked it with a torch and then a die grinder for the better part of 2 days, chasing tolerances that would let the Detroit's crank centerline sit true to the Deere's input shaft, because an 1/8 of an inch of misalignment at that joint would announce itself within 100 hours as a chewed pilot bearing and a vibration a man could feel through his boots. The custom bellhousing took longer still, 4 days at a machine shop 40 minutes south in Cavalier, where a semi-retired machinist with his own history of unlikely swaps agreed to true up the bore on a manual lathe, cutting a new register that would let the two mismatched worlds, two-stroke truck engine and 40-year-old farm transmission, meet on speaking terms. He drove down there each morning with the part wrapped in a moving blanket in the bed of his truck like something fragile and expensive, which, in the ways that mattered to him, it now was. The cooling stack came together out of what the farm already owned, and what the auction yard was willing to sell cheap. A radiator core salvaged from a dead freightliner, hose spliced and clamped from a truck parts bin in Grand Forks, a shroud he built himself from sheet metal to force air across fins that had never been asked to cool anything smaller than a highway engine pulling a loaded trailer up a grade. Every hose length, every clamp size, every torque value he used on the bellhousing bolts went into the binder in his own blunt hand, pages filling with diagrams that would have meant nothing to a stranger and everything to him. Because if the thing failed at 30 below in February, he intended to know exactly which joint to suspect first. By the 9th day, the shop smelled less like a barn and more like a machine shop proper, cutting oil, torch flux, the particular ozone tang of a grinder wheel worked too long, and the tractor sat on stands with its new heart half-seated in a frame it had not been born to hold, waiting on a transmission lineup he was not yet sure would agree to true. The morning it finally lined up true, the cold came down hard enough to frost the inside of the shop windows, and he stood a long moment before turning the key, running the numbers one more time in his head, the way another man might say a rosary. 85 foot-pounds on the bellhousing bolts, checked twice against the torque chart he'd penciled out himself, because the manual for a Detroit 8V71 said nothing about being married to a John Deere powertrain, and the manual for the 8630 said nothing about a two-stroke diesel with a compression release that barked like a shotgun before it settled into that low, uneven clatter unique to engines built for highway hauling rather than field work. He'd cut the adapter plate 3/4 of an inch thick for a reason, not the reason a machinist would have chosen from a catalog, but the reason a man chooses when he has watched driveline failures before and does not intend to explain another one to a banker. The engine caught on the second try, black smoke rolling off the stack in a column that hung in the frost like an accusation, and he let it idle 15 full minutes before he touched the hitch pin, watching gauges that weren't quite speaking the same language they used to, listening for the sound a bearing makes in the half-second before it announces itself for good. He'd told no one the exact day. The neighbor's prediction was still making its rounds at the coffee shop, that the driveline would twist in half the moment that Detroit 6 put its full torque against a loaded chisel plow in gumbo mud, that a truck engine had no business arguing with a transmission built to Deere's own tolerances. He backed up to the 24-foot plow alone, in the gray hour before the rest of the section woke, and dropped the pin himself, listening to the U-joints take up slack with a sound he'd heard 10,000 times on the old engine, and prayed would sound the same now. The first pass was slow, first gear half throttle, letting the new heart find its footing in ground already softened by 2 nights of rain, and he watched the talk, watched the temp gauge climb toward the number he'd calculated for that jury-rigged radiator, watched the plow bite 12 inches into black dirt that sucked at the shanks like it meant to keep them. Nothing screamed, nothing sheared. The tractor leaned into the load the way it always had, only louder, only rougher, only entirely, stubbornly still moving. By the third pass, he'd stopped watching the temp gauge every 10 seconds and started watching the ground instead, because the ground was the thing that mattered, and the ground was gumbo, that particular Red River Valley clay that turns to black grease when it's wet and swallows tires whole, that had already put 2 neighboring outfits in the ditch that week, tracked machines included. He'd heard on the radio at breakfast that a rented 4-wheel drive over toward Drayton had buried itself to the axles hauling a grain cart, and that the crew had spent half a day with a second tractor and a chain just getting it back to solid ground. His own tractor, the one with a truck engine bolted where a Deere long block used to sit, was holding 4.9 miles an hour, with the GPS unit clipped to the dash confirming it, pass after pass, hour after hour, through mud that had a name in 3 counties for stopping equipment cold. He didn't call anyone to tell them. He didn't need to. Word moved through Grafton the way it always did, through the elevator scale house and the parts counter and eventually the coffee shop, carried by men who'd driven past his section on their way to town and slowed down without meaning to, watching black dirt roll off a chisel plow behind a tractor that was supposed to be sitting in pieces in his shop. The predictions changed shape before they died out entirely. First, it was still going to happen. Give it a day, give it a week, that Detroit's going to walk the U-joints right off the yokes. Then it softened into a kind of reluctant arithmetic, men doing the math out loud over coffee that had gone cold in their hands. 300 acres, 4.9 miles an hour, a window closing hard at freeze-up, and a tractor that by every account they trusted was simply not stopping. He ran it into the dark most nights, headlights carving twin tunnels through fog that came up off the wet fields, the temp needle steady where he'd built the new radiator core to hold it, the exhaust note deeper and rougher than the old six had ever sung, but no less certain of itself. He kept a tally on a scrap of paper clipped to the dash. Acres finished, acres left, days until the ground would freeze hard enough to end the season whether the beets were out or not, and every evening that number closed a little further, the gap between what the co-op contract demanded and what the tractor was delivering narrowing pass by pass, mile by patient mile, through mud that had stopped everything else in the county that fall. The call came in on a Tuesday, the kind of gray, low-sky Tuesday that made the yard lights stay on past 9 in the morning, and it had nothing to do with the 8630 at all. The loader tractor, the second machine caught in the dealership's warranty language, the one they'd threatened alongside the planter back when the service manager had laid out his ultimatum across a countertop, had thrown a hydraulic code, something unrelated, something that would have happened to any operator on any farm regardless of what engine sat 200 yards away in the shop. He'd called it in the way he was supposed to, the way 20 years of documentation had trained him to, and the dealership dispatched a technician the way they were supposed to, and neither of them said a word on the phone about the Detroit sitting under a tarp of frost near the beet piler. The technician was younger than the service manager, quieter, the kind who read gauges before he read men, and he fixed the hydraulic fault inside 40 minutes with the unhurried competence of somebody who trusted his own hands more than his own paperwork. It was on his way back to the truck, notebook already half closed, that he stopped at the open shop door where the 8630 sat cooling from a morning's work. Mud still sheeted up the fenders, and looked, not the way a man glances at something out of politeness, but the way a man looks at something he's going to think about later. He asked, without any of the ceremony the service counter usually demanded, if he could get a few pictures of the bellhousing, then the adapter plates, then the cooling stack, tracing the salvaged radiator core and the rerouted hose with 2 fingers like he was reading a map instead of a repair. He said, almost to himself, that he'd seen factory tolerances tighter than what most reman shops turned out lately, and that whatever had cut these plates had held a truer line than anything crossing his service bay in months. He didn't mention the warranty. He didn't mention the voided coverage sitting somewhere in a file with his own employer's letterhead on it. He just took his photographs, thanked him for the coffee he hadn't been offered but was given anyway, and drove back toward town with a phone full of images he had no official reason to want. Nobody at the dealership ever called to walk anything back. No letter came reinstating what had been taken away at that countertop weeks before. But something had shifted all the same, quiet and unspoken, out there in the cold beside a tractor still ticking as it cooled, mud drying gray and stubborn on its tires. That was the winter he started copying the binder out by hand a second time, sitting at the same kitchen table where the $31,000 quote had once been laid out flat under the overhead light like a verdict. The original pages were already going soft at the corners, oil-stained and grease-thumbed from 9 days of fabrication. The pencil measurements for the bellhousing bore half-smudged where his palm had rested, while he checked a tolerance for the third or fourth time. He didn't trust that copy to last another 20 years, so he took a fresh notebook, the kind his son used for junior livestock records, and went through every page: the bolt pattern sketches, the radiator core dimensions, the length of hose scavenged and the length still needed, the exact torque values he'd guessed at first and then confirmed were right, and wrote it all again in a hand steadier than it had been that October, because there was no clock running this time, no beets standing wet in the ground, no 14-week wait breathing down his neck. His son read over his shoulder some evenings, asking why a truck engine's bellhousing bolt spacing would ever line up close enough to matter, and he'd explain it the way it had been explained to him by nobody, worked out instead at a bench with a square and a punch, and an evening's worth of failed attempts before the one that held. The beets had gone in 3 days ahead of freeze-up. Every last acre of the 300 weighed and settled against the $58,000 contract with the co-op like it had never been in doubt, though for a few gray weeks in October it very much had been. The tractor was still out there behind the shop when the ground froze hard, ticking down after fieldwork the way it always had, an 8630 badge on a hood that no longer matched what breathed underneath it, a machine the dealership had formally disowned and quietly admired within the same season. No letter ever came reversing the warranty. None was needed. The proof sat in the yard, mud-crusted and running, doing the only kind of talking that mattered on a farm, the kind measured in acres finished, not paperwork honored. He kept the original binder in the same drawer as the deed and the loan papers, where it belonged, evidence of a decision made at a kitchen table under pressure nobody outside that house had truly felt. The new one, the copy for his son, went out to the shop, tucked above the workbench where the bellhousing had first taken shape from a slab of 3/4-inch steel. Someday there'd be another rod knock, another quote too high, another 14 weeks nobody could afford to lose. The tractor would still be there. So would the plans.